Police in Illinois searched for a killer who was careful enough not to leave fingerprints, but who didn't bother to mask his identity. This is how a forensic scientist with some fancy footwork identified a perpetrator when not one but two eyewitnesses could not. The 19th of July, 1991 was typically hot and humid in Peoria, Illinois. Once the sun set and the temperature subsided, it was a perfect night for a cookout.
It was hot, very hot, and we had the windows open, and the back door was open.
Casey Johnson and her roommate Jennifer Logsdon spent the evening with Jennifer's fiancé Tommy Smith.
After we ate dinner, we went up to the grocery store and got stuff to make blizzards. And came back and we moved the coffee table out of the way and pulled our mattress out into the living room so we could all three lay down and watch TV.
They all watched a Stephen King horror movie, and less than 15 minutes later, Jennifer fell asleep. She awoke to sounds that didn't come from the television.
I could hear screaming.
She turned and saw Tommy. Tommy fighting an intruder who was armed with a knife. Casey ran to the phone to call police.
I can't hear you. You need to stop.
Before police arrived, the intruder wounded Tommy. Then he went after Jennifer.
I kept screaming as loud as I could. He just kept stabbing me all over.
What's going on? Huh? An intruder.
Jennifer grabbed the knife from her assailant.
I fought as hard as I could. I was hitting him and kicking.
But her actions only fueled his anger. The intruder got the knife back and attacked again.
And that's when he cut me twice and just left me for dead.
This person that broke into your house, does he have any weapons? Hello?
He then found Casey in the bedroom on the phone with the police.
Hello?
Jennifer managed to run to a neighbor's home for help.
I can't move. My throat is slit.
Who are you?
A lot of blood.
Can you describe this person that did it?
No, I can't.
How about maybe what he was wearing?
I don't remember.
When the police arrived, the intruder was gone.
I told the police I knew I was dying, but go and save Tommy and Casey.
But it was too late for 21-year-old Tommy Smith. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Jennifer and Casey were rushed to St. Francis Medical Center.
My father came to get me at work, and he told me that Tommy had been killed. And I immediately freaked out in disbelief, no, it wasn't him, not Tommy. And it wasn't soon after that it finally sunk in that, he was killed.
Tommy Smith's actions were quite heroic. He took it upon himself to apprehend the suspect and put him in a chair and stand over top of him, hold him there until the police arrived. And in doing so, he sacrificed his life.
I don't think Tommy could have ever lived with one of them getting killed, and especially Jennifer.
Paulus hoped the two girls would be able to identify their attacker. Connie Smith had to do what every parent dreads, plan the funeral of a child.
He was the neatest kid a mother could have. He was the best baby, best little boy, most loving young man. Even if he got mad, he never stayed mad long. He would have made a great dad. He would have made a great husband, because I know he was a great son.
Tommy's fiancée Jennifer was in the intensive care unit near death. She had sustained multiple stab wounds, a cut throat, and a punctured lung.
If Tommy Smith wouldn't have been in that house, those two young ladies wouldn't be here today. They'd be dead. And I believe that.
The crime scene gave mute testimony to the girls' intense will to survive.
He had really did a number on both of the young ladies.
They both exhibited a great deal of courage. They had very strong constitution. They had a very strong will to live.
Gradually, their conditions improved. But when they spoke to police, they could remember very little.
He just kept stabbing me all over, and nothing hurt. But I didn't see any blood either.
She did state that a black male had entered the home. She wasn't sure how.
And I can't remember what he looked like.
Investigators would have to rely on the crime scene for clues. They quickly concentrated their attention on the assailant's point of entry, a bedroom window.
The outside screen was jarred and out of place and cut.
Investigators were shocked by the amount of blood found in the home.
I think once he started cutting, he went into a frenzy. And at that point, he felt the only way that he could prevent the police from finding out who did this to these kids was to kill all three of them.
In one of the bedrooms amid the clutter, police found the wooden handle of the murder weapon.
When the handle of the knife was located at the crime scene, it speaks of our suspect's panic and his hurry to flee the scene.
Mrs. Johnson had grabbed the blade of the knife and was able to break it loose from the handle.
Unfortunately, there were no fingerprints on it. Police found a party invitation on the floor near the point of entry. Police used black magnetic powder to see if the killer may have knocked it to the floor during the struggle. They were looking for the friction ridges of a fingerprint.
On top of the friction ridges are pores, and that's where the perspiration comes from when the person sweats. And when they touch an item, they may or may not leave their identification through those unique characteristics.
On the invitation, Gary Siebenthal found what appeared to be a partial palm print, a print that did not belong to Tommy, Jennifer, or Casey. While interviewing neighbors, police were surprised to learn that despite the girls' screams, no one saw the killer leave the crime scene. Police thought they had solved the case when they found blood on the screen door of a neighbor's home. Gene Brown.
And he explained that he had cut himself on the lower leg carrying the garbage out earlier in the night.
Tests revealed the blood was Brown's, and investigators found broken glass in his trash can, which Brown said had caused the cut. Brown's palm print did not match the print on the party invitation at the crime scene, and neither Jennifer nor Casey identified their next-door neighbor as the assailant. Paula suspected the killer lived nearby since he fled the scene on foot, and it was the foot which would lead police to the killer. Gary Siebenthal refused to give up in the search for Tommy Smith's killer. In reviewing the case, Siebenthal recalled something Jennifer and Casey had both remembered about the intruder.
Taking the knife away from him because he had socks wrapped around his hand.
She did describe him as wearing, she thought, khaki shorts. He was also described as being a black male, approximately 6 foot, 6'1", slim build, with a mustache.
And the girls remembered something else. The intruder was barefoot. Why would a killer enter a home wearing socks on his hands, but nothing on his feet? If the killer was wearing socks on his hands, but nothing on his feet, and if the killer lived nearby, why didn't he cover his face?
He's breaking into a home where people can recognize him, will certainly recognize him. And I think by the fact that he went in there quietly, armed with a knife, that his intention all along was to do great harm to both the young ladies living there.
But the fact that he was barefoot quickly became the central focus of the investigation. That
led a little insight into what the strange print was on the card, because it didn't look like a palm print to the crime scene investigators. It was something strange that they really hadn't seen before.
It occurred to Siebenthal that the print on the party invitation might not be a palm print at all.
If you look at certain parts of the palm, they can mimic parts of the foot because they have the same characteristics. They have dots, short ridges, and bifurcations and trifurcations.
Was it possible that the perpetrator knocked the party invitation to the floor and then stepped on it? If so, the hot, muggy July night created the perfect conditions for leaving a print behind.
How he does that is through the moisture that the individual leaves in his fingerprints and his palm prints.
Siebenthal began the painstaking task of identifying the print. Using a microscope and a pointer, he examined the friction ridges, every bifurcation and trifurcation, which are points where one line divides into 2 or 3. Police have a fingerprint database they can refer to, but they don't collect footprints. On a hunch, police asked the girl's next-door neighbor, Gene Brown, for his.
We took his footprints through a search warrant, but taking footprints is something that the average person doesn't have to do when they're taken into custody.
Siebenthal compared Brown's footprints to the print on the party invitation.
You have to look for the uniqueness of those points of identification, and we found it on the outside left heel print of Gene Autry Brown.
Gary Siebenthal had a match, and it was the first time in the history of the Peoria Police Department that a footprint had been recovered from a crime scene. In a search of Brown's home, police discovered a set of knives which were identical to the murder weapon, but they also found Casey Johnson's purse. Police found bloody socks with the broken blade of the murder weapon inside, and in one of the socks was Jean Brown's wedding ring. Finally, investigators found tiny traces of blood in Brown's hair.
He must have had a great deal of blood on him when he left the house after attacking the 3 individuals, and he still had blood on his body.
DNA tests of the blood sample showed it was from all 3 victims, Tommy, Jennifer, and Casey. Jean Brown was arrested and charged with murder.
He had a wife. He had a cute little boy. He had a family that cared for him, you know. And because he chose drugs, he took my son away from me.
When you entered the house and started across the bedroom towards the door leading
I didn't
to the
see anyone until I got in the living room. By that time, the guy had jumped me, grabbed me.
Do you understand that you have the right to remain silent and you do not have to talk to me or answer any questions unless you voluntarily choose to do so?
Correct.
When police confronted Jean Brown with the mountain of evidence against him for the murder of 21-year-old Tommy Smith and the attacks on Jennifer Logsdon and Casey Johnson, he confessed. Did you stab him with the knife?
Say I stabbed him. So I don't know. We was struggling. It was more or less, he was trying to get the knife and I was trying to keep the knife, and at the same time, he was being cut.
Did you and he struggle for any length of time?
I'd say about 45 seconds.
What ended the struggle?
He walked away and fell to the floor.
Brown admitted using crack cocaine on the day of the attack. After having dinner with his wife and infant son, Brown said he needed money to buy more cocaine.
Went to bed, got up, put my clothes on, went next door.
He removed his shoes so he could walk quietly and used his socks to cover his hands to make sure he didn't leave any fingerprints. He entered the victim's home through an open window by removing the screen. But he never realized his feet could leave the very same prints as his fingers, just as distinctive, just as incriminating. Tommy Smith fought valiantly, but was no match for Brown's knife. Jennifer slipped out of the house when Brown was in the other room. Casey survived by playing dead after she was attacked. Prompt medical attention saved them both. Tommy Smith's best friend still struggles with the absurdity of it all.
It disgusted me that somebody would take a life like that for $1 so he could go get high. It was very, very senseless, a very senseless act.
You know, losing him so early, what made it bearable was he had 20 years and he enjoyed every one of them. He knew how to enjoy life.
Despite his confession, there are still parts of Brown's story detectives don't believe. Jennifer and Casey live next door.
Could not stand the thought of another mother standing over a casket with her son, so cold, and another family going through what this family's went through, you know. Having a son in prison for the rest of his life is bad, but nothing is worse than burying one.
I don't really know where to begin. I don't know why this happened, but it did. And all the time I've been sitting there talking to you guys, I wish there was a way that I could take it back. But it's done.
He would express remorse and state how sorry he was that this thing had happened. But at the same time, he would protect himself by not being able to recall just what had occurred.
It didn't happen. And I I'm still asking myself why. I don't know why.
Jennifer Logston is now married with children, but she still lives with emotional and physical scars from that attack.
He said he was sorry. He didn't mean to do it. And I can't forgive him yet. Yeah, I think he got what he deserved.
When you get caught doing something, you say, I'm sorry. Would you say you're sorry if you didn't get caught? I say, I don't know. I don't believe that.
If Gene Brown hadn't gone barefoot that night, investigators wouldn't have recovered the valuable footprint that placed him at the crime scene.
Well, I think it's the greatest irony of all, to be so smart and get caught.
It just goes to show you the best laid plans of mice or men. You know, he in fact tried to go in barefoot so that he would be quiet and be able to move through the house quietly, and in fact left behind, a tremendous piece of evidence.
When you're able to point out to your suspect that they in fact are the best witness that we have against themselves, and in the case of this particular footprint that was left, he did seal his own fate.
An affluent young woman was found dead in her home while her husband was off on a sailing trip. Police uncovered allegations of sex parties and wife swapping. But it was an old movie, an overheard telephone call, and an air conditioner that cracked the case. Ed and Ellen Sherman lived in Niantic, Connecticut for the entire 16 years of their marriage. Ed taught business at a local community college and was a member of Mensa, an organization for people with exceptionally high IQs. Ellen was 5.5 months pregnant and worked in the family publishing business.
Ellen Sherman was a sweetheart. Everybody that met Ellen just adored her. She had a smile and a friendly hello for everyone.
On a Friday night in August of 1985, Ed left for a week-long sailing trip with four friends.
They are always fun. Yeah, we always have a great time. And that's great sailing from Maine down. We stop at the Vineyard and Nantucket and what have you. Boys' night out type thing.
On Sunday afternoon, 2 days into the trip, Ed called his pregnant wife to make sure she was okay. After numerous calls went unanswered, Ed contacted Len Fredrickson, a good friend of the couple, and asked him to check on Ellen.
I got over there when it was just starting to get dark, and I could hear the air conditioner running in the house. The lights were on the inside and the outside. I checked all the doors. They were locked. It was locked up, which was very strange because they always left the house open. I used to kid Ellen about, you're going to come home some night and there'll be nothing left in your house.
No one answered the door, so Fredrickson entered the home through an unlocked window. Inside was the family dog. He called for Ellen, but there was no answer. Upstairs, he opened the bedroom door and found Ellen's lifeless body on the bed.
I had no idea what had happened. I didn't think that she'd been murdered, and why would I think that anybody would murder this wonderful person?
It appeared at first glance as if she were the subject of a sexual assault, and her night clothing was on the floor, and her underwear and the bedding.
Ellen's neck indicated strangulation. The medical examiner determined that the murder occurred sometime Saturday night or early Sunday morning based on rigor mortis. The temporary stiffening of the body after death, the lines on her fingernails were evidence. They had been bent backwards.
Could be because during the strangulation, victim tried to keep themselves free. And meanwhile, trying to struggle with the perpetrator, may scratch the floor.
Police found no signs of forced entry, and no valuables were missing, which ruled out robbery using a ship. To shore radio, a policeman gave Ed Sherman the bad news.
He talked to him for a while, which I wasn't listening to, but he eventually did hand me the microphone and said, Wayne, take this, it's the police. They said Ellen's been killed.
Detective Mike Malchik soon learned that the Shermans' lives were far from ordinary. It was a lifestyle of deception, sex, and intrigue. The medical examiner estimated that Ellen Sherman was murdered sometime over the weekend, while her husband was sailing in the Atlantic Ocean with friends. Ed Sherman told investigators that he last spoke with his wife on Friday night from his friend's house.
They said that Mr. Sherman did get on the phone when he's telling his wife, go to the bank to make this deposit, all these different things.
And Ed Sherman was unusually candid about their sex life.
If you had to describe your marriage, what type of a marriage would you say you had?
girlfriend had a child, and it was his child.
The woman was Ed's co-worker, Nancy Prescott.
She was very different than Ellen. In fact, Ellen used to refer to her as Ed's Valley girl. She was blonde and very different looking. Ed wanted an open marriage. He encouraged Ellen to have affairs.
And Ed Sherman's lifestyle was unusual in other ways.
I remember being at a New Year's Eve party at their house. I believe it was 1984. They had several couples there, and I guess they were going to swap partners. I was with a young lady, and Ed asked me if I was interested, and I asked the young lady that I was with if she was interested, and I just said, we'll leave, and we did. So Ed was really the one that was pushing that type of situation. Ellen did not want that in her life.
I was totally unaware of and would not have guessed it.
Since there were no signs of forced entry, police suspected Ellen may have known her killer.
From downstairs to upstairs, everything in proper order. No sign of a ransack or violent struggles. If a foreign intruder, usually we see some sign of struggle.
Dr. Henry Lee, at the time the director of Connecticut's crime lab, was called in to assist investigators. Dr. Lee examined photos of the ligature marks on Ellen Sherman's neck.
The ligature marks on Ellen Sherman's neck, and found a faint pattern.
And this pattern is a zigzag pattern, which is so unique. Initially, we don't know where they come from.
He compared this to the clothing found at the scene, including the torn panties.
Subsequently, when we start stretching the panty, you can see this zigzag pattern. The space start opening up and shows identical pattern as what left on the neck.
But other evidence showed that Ellen was strangled with bare hands, not the panties. The autopsy revealed the cricoid cartilage in the neck had been fractured, something which cannot be accomplished during ligature strangulation. Dr. Lee believes the killer wrapped the panties around her neck afterwards in order to stage the crime scene to make it look like a sex crime. On the bedsheet under ultraviolet light was biological evidence investigators hoped would identify the killer.
Extremely unusual is the bedsheet we found close to 150 to 200 individual semen stain. That's a lot of semen stain.
This biological evidence was too badly degraded for DNA testing, which meant the material had been there for quite some time and had survived laundering. While searching for suspects, police discovered that Ed's mistress Nancy Prescott may have been angry with Ed and Ellen. Ed had recently agreed to end the affair to save his marriage.
When Ellen got pregnant, she said, I want you to stay home and be a father to this baby and be there when it's born and give up the girlfriend.
So they talked it out, and Ed said that he was willing to give up his girlfriend and that he would be a father and a husband to Ellen.
I terminated the relationship with this other woman. I was angry because I had to make a decision. And so I told Nancy, can't handle it anymore. She kept asking me, why?
Detectives asked Ed to take a polygraph test. He agreed. The results were inconclusive, and Nancy Prescott had an alibi for the day of the murder. The trail of the killer was starting to turn cold.
Mike Malchek had promised Ellen's mother, Rose, that he would stay on the case and that they would find out who did this to her daughter.
Then Malchek got lucky. He learned there was a movie that featured a murder identical to Ellen Sherman's.
Would this film lead police to the killer? Initially, police didn't consider Ed Sherman a suspect in his wife's murder since he was on a sailboat in the Atlantic Ocean the day she died.
This case is in the middle of the ocean. A perfect alibi. A four witness. Time of the death become very important in many homicide investigation because that result, time of the death, you can impeach a witness statement or suspect statement or collaborate with the suspect statement. However, time of the death is difficult area.
Rigor mortis is one way to estimate the time of death. This is what a body looks like when rigor mortis occurs, a stiffening of the entire body that lasts for a long time. It lasts between 12 and 24 hours after death. When Ellen's body was discovered, it was in the final stages of rigor mortis and becoming more pliable. In looking through the investigator's report, Dr. Lee discovered an important clue. It was something Len Fredrickson said when he found Ellen's body.
It was like open a freezer almost.
The air conditioner was going full blast. The person later described it as being extremely cold in the room, colder than a normal person would have their air conditioner on.
A freezing cold room, the slow decomposition, and the progress of rigor mortis. This meant that Ellen Sherman's murder could have occurred earlier than originally estimated.
Here it's clear. The time of the death is definite, not Sunday. Although we don't know exactly hours, every indicator pointed out it's Friday sometime.
If Ellen was murdered on Friday night, then Ed Sherman would have had plenty of time to commit the crime. Police also learned that Sherman was wearing long pants and a long-sleeved shirt on the sailing trip in August.
And looking back on it, we were all in shorts and t-shirts, and he had long pants on and a turtleneck. I never saw him on the boat with short sleeves on.
Since Ellen's fingernails had been damaged, police suspected that Ed might have been hiding scratch marks. Ed vigorously denied this and insisted his wife was alive when he left. He said he even spoke to her from his friend's home by telephone in front of witnesses. If true, Ed couldn't have been the killer. I'll have a good weekend. But Ed wasn't the only one listening into that conversation. His friend's daughter was too. She picked up and was getting ready to make a call.
She picked up and was getting ready to make a call, I guess.
She said, well, I heard Mr. Sherman talking on the phone.
And she says, well, I was on the other end, and it was just ringing and ringing, and I heard him saying, I love you too, and there was nobody there.
And they said, why didn't you hang up? And she said, well, I thought it was very unusual because he was talking to a ringing phone.
It's 5 minutes after he leaves his house, he fakes a phone call to his wife. I mean, that's hard to explain.
Little did he know that, some 9-year-old girl was going to bring him down. He wasn't as smart as he thought he was.
And there was another interesting development. A witness told police that she had run into Ed on the morning of his sailing trip. During the conversation, Ed recommended she watch a movie he particularly enjoyed called Blackout. In the film, a man kills his wife and children, puts the bodies inside the house, then manipulates the crime scene in order to fool family, forensic scientists, and mask the true time of death.
Richard Woodmark, who plays the detective, comes out to the press and says, the time of death is going to be very difficult to determine because the bodies were put in a cold room with the air conditioner turned all the way up.
The medical examiner estimates they were dead for at least 3 days. The air conditioning system in the house was turned on, apparently to slow the decomposition of the bodies.
It will slow the decomposition of the bodies. He also asked me one time if I knew how a body decomposed. I thought that was a very strange question, I said. Number truth is absolutely stranger than fiction. I mean, there are so many things that happen in real life that there is no need to make anything up. It is awful. Police and prosecutors alike wondered what motivated Ed Sherman to kill his wife. Despite the apparent reconciliation, friends say Ellen decided she wanted a divorce. Since Ellen was the majority owner of the family business, she allegedly told Ed that she would leave him with almost nothing.
And Ellen said he can have his girlfriend and his sailboat, and that's it. So I said to her, are you sure this is what you want to do? She says, I can't live like this anymore. She says, he's never going to be a husband and a father to our children. He's always going to have this double life.
Prosecutors believe that Ed Sherman carefully planned his wife's murder. The couple had a light dinner, and then, while Ellen was changing her clothes in the bedroom, prosecutors say Ed strangled her to death. The forensic evidence shows that Ellen was dead before Ed wrapped the panties around her neck to make the murder appear to be a sex crime. Inspired by the movie Blackout, he set the air conditioner to its coldest setting, closed the door, and left for the sailing trip around 7 p.m. later that night. To cement his alibi, he staged the call to his wife in front of his friends. Not knowing his friend's daughter was listening in, Sherman called Len Fredrickson from the sailboat on Sunday evening, asking him to check on his wife, hoping the cold temperature of the bedroom would mask the true time of death, just like the movie. It fooled forensic scientists, but only for a while.
Of course, witness play an important factor. The first person discovered the body, feel the temperature call. The young lady listen on the phone. Of course, no, he's lying. By signs, we fill the gap. Shows something is impossible. The time of the death Sunday is impossible. Then we show what's more probable, a Friday. Then we show the weapon and the motive. He almost got away. Very close.
Detective Malchik arrested Ed Sherman for murder.
He knew that I knew that he was the one that had murdered his wife. And when he saw me, he looked at me, and I just walked in. I was the first one in, and he looked over, and I said, Ed, it's time. And he turned white, he started to sweat, and he knew it was time.
And the forensic evidence mattered most to jurors. During deliberations, they asked to hear again the testimony of Dr. Lee and the medical examiner, particularly on the time of death. "6 years after his wife's death, the jury found Ed Sherman guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 50 years in prison. While Ed Sherman never admitted guilt, he did show some remorse.
He said she deserved a better lifestyle, and then he apologized for leading such an indulgent lifestyle. And then he said, I do not know who killed Ellen.
After spending only 3 years in prison, Ed Sherman died of a heart attack at the age of 52.
He was a very bright individual, high IQ, and liked to make people know that he was smarter than you. That's the way he made me feel. And I've heard the same from other people. Ed thought he could have whatever Ed wanted.
He's got to be an awful cold person to be able to do that. That's a hands-on crime. And she's pregnant with his own child, and it is a son. So he's a cold, calculating person. Doesn't deserve any sympathy from anybody.
But Sherman was not smarter than the detectives and scientists who investigated the case.
In my years of doing this, I've never seen a case where a body was placed in an air-conditioned room and it was turned up to the maximum degree to apparently throw off the time of death.
This case demonstrates how important the teamwork. Detectives, witness, scientists will work together, did not give up.
Arizona 1990 cold case solved. Hidden DNA matched across the entire county. The desert had been silent for 30 years, but on a cold morning in Arizona, inside a forgotten evidence room buried beneath layers of dust and old case files, one tiny piece of the past was about to be found. A single DNA match, a result nobody expected, a name investigators had never imagined seeing. And a cold case that had haunted an entire county since 1990 was suddenly alive again. For decades, the question remained unanswered. Who was responsible? Why did the truth disappear? And how could someone walk away from a crime that left a community terrified for generations? In 1990, the small desert community, the communities of Arizona, were places where people trusted their neighbors. Front doors were often left unlocked. Families gathered under the orange glow of summer sunsets. Local businesses knew every customer by name. The streets were quiet, the nights were calm, until one disappearance shattered that sense of safety forever. Her name was Emily Carter. She was 27 years old, a young woman known throughout the county for her kindness, her determination, and the way she always stopped to help people who needed it. On the evening of the 14th of September 1990, Emily left her workplace just after sunset. A normal day, a normal routine, a familiar road home, but she never arrived. At first, nobody believed anything terrible had happened. Friends assumed she had stayed somewhere overnight. Family members thought maybe her car had broken down. Police initially treated it as a missing person case, but as the hours turned into days, the fear began spreading. Because Emily was not the kind of person who disappeared. She answered phone calls. She kept appointments. She always told someone where she was going. The silence was the first warning sign. 3 days after her disappearance, investigators found her abandoned vehicle on a remote stretch of desert road outside the county limits. The car was locked, her belongings were still inside, her purse, her identification, her personal items. Everything appeared untouched, except for one detail. The driver's seat was pulled back, as if someone else had been sitting there. The discovery transformed the investigation instantly. This was no longer a missing person case. Something had happened. Something someone wanted hidden. The desert became a crime scene. Detectives searched every inch of the area. They walked through miles of dry land under broad daylight. They found nothing. No trace of Emily. No suspicious signs. It was as if the earth had swallowed all evidence of her existence. Then came a breakthrough, but not the kind they had hoped for. On a small piece of material collected from Emily's car, they found a tiny detail. A scrap of material. A few details had hinted at a struggle, but none of it was enough. The fingerprint was incomplete. The sample was too damaged. Technology in 1990 had limitations that investigators could not overcome. The evidence went into storage. The file went onto a shelf, and slowly the case became another name in a growing list of unsolved crimes. A cold case, a mystery frozen in time. Years passed. The county changed. Buildings were constructed. Families moved away. Children who were young when Emily vanished became adults. But the memory never disappeared. Her family continued searching for answers. Every anniversary brought the same painful question. Would they ever know what happened? Would anyone ever be held responsible? For investigators, the case became a painful reminder of the past, a reminder of unfinished work. Detective Mark Reynolds, one of the original investigators, never forgot the file, even after retirement. He kept a copy of Emily's photograph in his office, not because he believed a miracle would happen, but because he believed someone, somewhere, knew the truth. And secrets have a way of surviving. Then came the technology that changed everything. Decades after Emily disappeared, forensic science advanced beyond anything investigators in 1990 could have imagined. Old evidence was being reopened across the country. Cold cases that had remained frozen for decades were suddenly moving again. DNA analysis was rewriting history. Tiny biological traces, once considered useless, were becoming powerful evidence. And in Arizona, investigators decided to take another look at Emily Carter's case. The original evidence was carefully removed from storage. Every item was examined again. Every report was reviewed. Every forgotten detail was questioned. Because sometimes the answer to the question is not hidden in a new discovery. Sometimes it is hidden in something everyone already saw, but nobody could understand. The fingerprint became the focus. The same fingerprint detectives had studied decades earlier. The same partial print that once led nowhere. Now, with new technology, experts believed they might be able to extract more information. The evidence was sent to a modern forensic laboratory. The process was slow, precise, unforgiving. Scientists examined the old sample under advanced equipment. They compared patterns. They analyzed biological material. They searched databases. For months, there was no response, no match, no suspect, no breakthrough. Until one morning, a notification appeared. A match had been found. The room went silent, because the name connected to the evidence was not random. It was someone who had lived in the area in 1990, someone investigators had never considered a suspect, someone whose connection to the case had remained invisible for 30 years. The cold case was no longer cold. A hidden piece of the past had finally opened the door, and when detectives looked deeper into the man behind the DNA match, they discovered a story filled with unanswered questions, forgotten relationships, and a connection to Emily Carter's final days that would shock the entire county. For 30 years, the evidence had been waiting. The desert had been waiting. And now, the truth was beginning to rise in the place where everyone thought it had been buried forever. The investigation was about to enter its most unexpected chapter, because the person who held the answers had been closer than anyone imagined. And the secret that survived 3 decades was finally ready to be exposed. The discovery changed everything. For 3 decades, Emily Carter's name was not known to the public. Her name had existed inside a cold case file surrounded by unanswered questions, a photograph, a missing person report, a vehicle abandoned under the Arizona sun, a family waiting for a phone call that never came. But now, for the first time in years, investigators had something they had never possessed before, a direction, a name, a connection. The DNA match belonged to Daniel Whitmore, a man who had lived in the same county during the summer of 1990, a man whose name had never appeared in the original investigation, a man who, according to public records, had crossed paths with Emily Carter shortly before she vanished. The discovery sent shockwaves through the county. Residents who had spent decades wondering what happened suddenly found themselves asking a different question. How had someone connected to the case remained invisible for so long. The investigators knew one thing immediately. A DNA match was not the end of the investigation. It was a beginning. Because a name alone did not explain a crime. It did not reveal motive. It did not reveal opportunity. And it did not answer the most painful question of all. What happened to Emily Carter on that September night in 1990? Detectives reopened every piece of evidence, the old reports, the interviews, the photographs, the handwritten notes from investigators who were no longer alive. They searched through every detail that had been forgotten over the years, and slowly a pattern began to appear. Daniel Whitmore had lived a quiet life after 1990, at least. That was what most people believed. He was not a famous criminal. He had not appeared in headlines. He had not been publicly linked to violence. He had worked ordinary jobs, maintained ordinary relationships, built an ordinary life. That was what made the discovery so disturbing. The person investigators were now examining was not a stranger hiding in the shadows. He was someone who had blended into the community, someone who had watched the years pass while one family continued to suffer. Detectives began reconstructing Whitmore's life during the time of Emily's disappearance. In 1990, he was 32 years old. He worked as a mechanic at a small repair shop outside town. The shop was located only a few miles from the road where Emily's vehicle was eventually found, a detail investigators immediately considered significant. During the original investigation, police had interviewed employees at several nearby businesses, but Whitmore's name had never stood out. There was no arrest, no accusation, no reason to believe he was involved. At least, not back then. But now, decades later, detectives looked at everything differently. The location, the timing, the evidence, the DNA. All of it pointed toward one uncomfortable possibility. Someone had been missed. The investigators returned to the old crimes. The desert had changed. New roads had been built. Old landmarks had disappeared, but the emptiness remained. Standing there decades later, detectives tried to imagine what happened that night. A woman driving home, a vehicle stopping on a lonely road, a person approaching. A moment that changed everything. The investigators searched the area again using modern techniques. They examined places that had been overlooked. They studied old maps. They compared satellite images. They searched for anything that could connect Whitmore to the crime. Then came another discovery, a witness, someone who had never spoken to investigators in 1990. Her name was Linda Harper. She had lived near the desert road at the time. For years, she believed what she saw that night was meaningless. A small memory, a passing moment, something she eventually forgot. But when detectives showed her a photograph of Daniel Whitmore, everything changed. Because she remembered a vehicle, a dark pickup truck, parked near the same area where Emily's car was discovered. And behind the wheel was a man. A man she described as nervous, a man who appeared to be watching the road. At the time, she never reported it. Why would she? In 1990, she had no reason to believe she had witnessed anything connected to a crime. But 30 years later, that forgotten memory suddenly became one of the most important pieces of the investigation. The case that had been silent for decades began moving rapidly. Detectives started building a timeline. Emily left work at approximately 7:15 p.m. Her vehicle was believed to have been abandoned sometime that night. Whitmore's employment records showed he finished work shortly before Emily disappeared. His home was only 20 minutes away. His location, his connection, his DNA. The evidence was creating a picture investigators could no longer ignore. But there was still a problem. Whitmore was not talking. When detectives approached him for an interview, he appeared calm. Almost too calm. He agreed to speak. He answered basic questions. He claimed he barely remembered Emily. He said he had never been involved with her disappearance. And when asked about the DNA evidence, he insisted there had to be a mistake, a coincidence, a misunderstanding. But investigators had spent decades waiting for this moment. They knew the difference between a cold case and a solved case. The evidence had to survive scrutiny. Every claim had to be tested. Every possibility had to be examined. Because after 30 years of uncertainty, they could not afford to get it wrong. The county watched closely as rumors spread. Old newspapers were pulled from archives. Residents began discussing memories they had buried for years. People who had once lived near Emily started coming forward with new information. The past was reopening, and with every new detail, the mystery surrounding that night became darker. Investigators discovered that Whitmore had given conflicting statements about where he was the night Emily vanished. Small differences, tiny inconsistencies, details that might have meant nothing in 1990, but now combined with DNA evidence, they became impossible to ignore. The man who had lived quietly for 30 years was suddenly at the center of the investigation. The question was no longer whether investigators had found a connection. The question was whether they had finally found the person responsible. As detectives dug deeper into Daniel Whitmore's past, they uncovered another shocking detail, a detail that had been hidden for decades, a detail that suggested Emily Carter's disappearance was not a random tragedy. It was connected to a secret that someone had spent 30 years trying to keep buried. And the deeper investigators went, the more they realized that the cold case that shocked Arizona was about to reveal a truth nobody was prepared to face. The investigation had reached a point nobody in Arizona had expected. After 30 years of silence, the case was moving again. But the deeper detectives looked into Daniel Whitmore's past, the more disturbing the picture became, because the evidence was no longer just pointing toward a person. It was revealing a hidden timeline, a series of moments, a chain of events that had been buried beneath decades of unanswered questions. And at the center of it all was Emily Carter, the woman whose disappearance had haunted an entire county, the woman whose family had spent years searching for a truth they feared they would never find. When investigators reopened the case, they did not just examine Daniel Whitmore. They went back to Emily. They wanted to understand her final days, her final conversations, her final movements. Because every cold case begins with the same question. What was different about that day? What changed? What placed someone in danger when they had been safe only hours before? Detectives interviewed Emily's former co-workers. Many of them remembered the same thing. She was happy that week. Nothing seemed wrong. No indication that she believed someone was following her. But one co-worker remembered something unusual. A conversation Emily had 2 days before she vanished. A conversation she seemed uncomfortable with. According to the witness, Emily had mentioned that someone had been asking questions about her. Someone she did not know well, someone who seemed interested in her personal life. At the time, nobody considered it important. People meet strangers. People forget small moments. But decades later, investigators looked at that memory differently. The smallest details often become the biggest clues, especially when everything else is gone. Detectives began searching through old records connected to Daniel Whitmore. They discovered something that had never been fully investigated, a connection between Whitmore and a location near where Emily's vehicle was found. In 1990, Whitmore occasionally worked late nights repairing vehicles for private customers. One of those customers lived near the desert road, the same area where Emily's abandoned car was discovered. The information was not proof, but it created a possibility, and possibilities are where cold cases begin to crack. Investigators then turned their attention toward the original evidence, the fingerprint, the piece of evidence that had survived 30 years, the piece that had once been considered useless. Back in 1990, forensic technology could only tell investigators that the print belonged to an unknown person. That was all. No identity, no match, no answer. But modern forensic analysis changed the situation. Experts examined the print again. They enhanced the image. They studied the ridges. They compared it against updated databases. And then they found something unexpected. The fingerprint was not just connected to DNA evidence. It matched the same individual, Daniel Whitmore. For investigators, the moment was overwhelming, because 2 separate pieces of evidence from different scientific methods had reached the same conclusion: a fingerprint, a DNA profile, both pointing toward the same person. The case that had remained frozen for decades suddenly had movement. But there was still a question that troubled investigators. Why? Why Emily? Why that night? Why did someone with no obvious connection become involved in a crime that destroyed so many lives? The answer began to emerge from people who knew Whitmore. Former co-workers described him as quiet, reserved, someone who kept his personal life private. But some also remembered a darker side. A temper, a need for control, a tendency to become angry when situations did not go his way. Those details had never seemed important before. But now they created a disturbing pattern. Investigators searched deeper. They found old complaints, minor incidents, arguments, moments where Whitmore's behavior had raised concerns. Nothing that had resulted in serious consequences, nothing that had placed him on law enforcement's radar, but enough to make detectives wonder, had everyone simply been looking in the wrong direction? For 30 years, the community had imagined the person responsible as a stranger, a criminal passing through, a mysterious figure from outside the county. Nobody wanted to believe the truth could be closer, because the most frightening possibility was not that a dangerous person existed somewhere far away. It was that someone could live among them, work beside them, walk through the same streets, and carry a secret nobody knew. As detectives prepared to confront Whitmore with the new evidence, they faced another challenge. The years had changed everything. Memories had faded. Witnesses had moved. Some had passed away. Physical evidence had disappeared. The investigation was racing against time, but one thing remained: the evidence. Evidence that had waited patiently for technology to catch up. The arrest shocked the county. When news spread that investigators had identified a suspect in Emily Carter's disappearance, people gathered outside the courthouse. Some were relieved, some were angry, some were simply stunned, because for decades, the case had become part of the community's identity, a reminder of a mystery nobody could solve. Now that mystery had a name: Daniel Whitmore. But the story was not over, not even close. A piece of evidence explained why the investigation had failed in 1990, a mistake, a decision, a moment where the truth had been sitting in front of investigators all along, and the revelation would force everyone to ask the same question: how much sooner could Emily Carter's family have had answers? How many years had been lost? How many birthdays? How many anniversaries? How many nights spent wondering if the truth would ever come? The cold case that had haunted Arizona for 30 years was finally opening. But with every answer came a new wave of pain, because solving a mystery does not erase the past. It only reveals what happened, and sometimes the truth is more devastating than the silence that came before it. The investigation continued, the evidence grew stronger, and the final pieces of Emily Carter's story were beginning to fall into place. But hidden inside those old files was one last secret, a secret that would change how everyone remembered the night Emily disappeared. The desert wind moved across Arizona, like it was carrying the voices of the past. For 30 years, those voices had been trapped inside old police reports, forgotten evidence boxes, and memories that slowly faded with time. But now, the silence was breaking. The name Daniel Whitmore had changed everything. A man who had lived quietly for decades was suddenly connected to one of the most haunting mysteries in county history: the disappearance of Emily Carter. A case that had once seemed impossible to solve, a case that had defeated investigators, frustrated detectives, and left a family trapped between hope and heartbreak. But behind every cold case is a moment, a single moment where everything changes. For Emily Carter's case, that moment came from something nobody expected, a piece of evidence that had been sitting untouched for decades, waiting, watching, holding a secret. The fingerprint. The same fingerprint that investigators had photographed in 1990. The same fingerprint that had once been labeled incomplete. The same fingerprint that had been placed inside an evidence file and forgotten. For years, detectives believed it would never reveal anything. Technology had reached its limit. The print was too damaged, too unclear, too old. But time had changed the rules. Modern forensic science had turned impossible cases into headlines. And now, the fingerprint was speaking. When forensic experts compared the enhanced print with Daniel Whitmore's records, the results shocked investigators. The match was undeniable, a hidden connection between the past and the present, a clue that had survived longer than anyone involved in the original investigation could have imagined. But investigators knew they were standing at a dangerous point. A fingerprint could open a door. It could create suspicion. It could change the direction of an investigation. But it could not answer every question. They needed to know why. They needed to understand the events leading up to Emily's disappearance. Because the truth was not only hidden in evidence, it was hidden in the final hours of her life. Detectives rebuilt Emily's timeline minute by minute. They went back to the 14th of September, 1990, the last day anyone knew where she was. The morning started like any other. Emily arrived at work. She greeted coworkers. She completed her responsibilities. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing suggested danger was waiting. But investigators discovered one small detail, a detail that had been overlooked for decades. A phone call. According to old workplace records, Emily received a call shortly before leaving. The person on the other end was never identified. In 1990, investigators attempted to trace the call, but the technology was limited. The records were incomplete. The information disappeared into the thousands of pages inside the case file. For years, nobody knew if that call mattered. But after the DNA discovery, detectives returned to it. They questioned former employees. They searched over and over again. They looked for anyone who might remember. And slowly, a picture began forming. Emily had sounded different after the call. Not afraid, not panicked, but distracted, as if something had changed. At the time, nobody thought twice. People have strange moments every day. A phone call, a worried expression, a sudden change in mood. But investigators now understood something important. Cold cases are built from details people ignored, moments that seem meaningless until years later, when they suddenly become impossible to ignore. The investigation turned toward Daniel Whitmore's relationship with Emily. At first, detectives believed they had no connection, but deeper research revealed a surprising discovery. They had met before. Not closely, not publicly, but enough. Whitmore had visited the repair shop where Emily occasionally brought her vehicle. Records showed his name appearing months before her disappearance. A simple customer interaction. Something nobody remembered. Something nobody considered important. But now it raised a terrifying possibility. Had Whitmore noticed Emily before that night? Had he watched her routine? Had he learned more about her life than anyone realized? Detectives began searching through Whitmore's background. They discovered he had moved several times after 1990. Each move appeared normal. Each job appeared ordinary. But investigators noticed something unsettling. Every time questions about his past became difficult, Whitmore changed his story. Small changes, minor differences, but enough to create doubt. During his first interview after the DNA discovery, Whitmore insisted he barely knew Emily. He said he remembered seeing her at the repair shop, but claimed their interactions were brief. Nothing unusual, nothing personal. However, detectives discovered another witness, a former employee who remembered something different. The witness claimed Whitmore had asked questions about Emily, questions that seemed unusual: where she lived, what time she usually left work, whether she had family nearby. At the time, nobody reported it, nobody thought it was suspicious. But now, those questions carried a completely different meaning. The investigation became a race to uncover what happened before the evidence disappeared forever. Detectives located former residents who had lived near the desert road. Some remembered hearing something that night. A vehicle, a loud argument, a sound that disturbed the quiet desert. But memories after 30 years were fragile. Some details were clear. Others were uncertain. And investigators knew they had to separate truth from imagination, because one mistake could destroy the case. One wrong assumption could allow the past to remain buried. Meanwhile, the community watched everything unfold. For decades, Emily's disappearance had been an open wound. Residents remembered a fear that spread through the county in 1990. Parents warned their children. Neighbors looked at strangers differently. The disappearance changed the way people saw their own hometown. Now, after 30 years, the possibility of an answer brought mixed emotions: relief, anger, sadness, and one painful realization: the person responsible may have been living among them all along. The investigation soon uncovered another shocking detail: a hidden connection between Daniel Whitmore and the night Emily vanished. A piece of information that had never appeared in the original reports. A witness statement that had been overlooked. A detail that changed the entire direction of the case. Detectives discovered that Whitmore had contacted someone shortly after Emily disappeared. A conversation that lasted only a few minutes. A conversation that seemed meaningless at the time. But investigators now believed it could explain what happened during the hours after Emily left work. The person who received the call had never been considered important. They had never been treated as part of the investigation, because in 1990, nobody knew what investigators know now. The smallest connection can become the biggest clue. The past does not disappear. It waits, and as detectives continued digging, they realized Emily Carter's final moments were not lost forever. They were hidden piece by piece, waiting for someone to put them together. The cold case that had remained unsolved for 3 decades was no longer just a mystery. It was becoming a story of forgotten evidence, a story of missed opportunities, a story of a family that refused to stop searching, and a story of a hidden truth that had survived beneath the Arizona desert sun. But investigators were still missing one final piece. The piece that would explain exactly what happened on that September night. The piece that would finally reveal how Emily Carter disappeared. Why someone spent 30 years trying to make sure nobody ever found out. The investigation had reached a dangerous turning point. After 30 years of unanswered questions, detectives finally had a suspect. But a suspect was not the same as justice. The evidence had opened the door. Now investigators had to walk through it carefully. Because behind every piece of information was a family waiting for answers, a community waiting for closure, and a woman whose final moments had remained hidden for 3 decades. Emily Carter, the name that had never disappeared, the face that remained on missing person posters long after the paper had faded, the case file that continued to sit in storage, untouched, while the world moved forward. But now, the past was returning, and it was bringing secrets with it. After the fingerprint connection was confirmed, investigators began a full reconstruction of Daniel Whitmore's movements in 1990. They studied his employment records, his financial history, his relationships, his locations. Every detail mattered, because the question was no longer whether Whitmore had crossed paths with Emily. The evidence suggested he had. The question was whether investigators could prove what happened after those paths crossed. The answer was hidden somewhere between the last known moments of Emily's life and the discovery of her abandoned vehicle. A gap of time. A gap where a person disappeared, a gap where a crime may have occurred. Detectives returned to the original police reports, pages that had been written decades earlier. pages filled with handwritten notes, faded photographs, and theories that never became answers. They noticed something immediately. The original investigation had focused heavily on strangers, possible travelers, unknown criminals, passing through the area, people with no connection to Emily, but investigators in 2026 saw the case differently. They followed a new question. What if the person responsible was not a stranger? What if the person responsible already knew her routine? That possibility changed everything. The investigation shifted. Instead of searching outward, detectives looked closer. They examined people who had been near Emily's life, co-workers, customers, neighbors, anyone who may have had contact with Emily, anyone who may have had access to information. And slowly, Daniel Whitmore became more difficult to explain. Former employees from the repair shop remembered him differently. Some described him as polite, quiet, reliable, the kind of person nobody suspected, but others remembered moments that felt uncomfortable, moments that seemed insignificant at the time. One former co-worker recalled Whitmore becoming angry when questioned about his whereabouts. Another remembered that he disliked people asking about his personal life, small details almost meaningless, until they were placed beside the DNA evidence. Then they became something else. A pattern. Investigators discovered that Whitmore had left Arizona several years after Emily disappeared. He moved from town to town, never staying long enough to attract attention, never creating a record that connected him to the case. To most people, it looked like an ordinary life, a man changing jobs, a man starting over. But detectives saw something different. They saw a distance. They saw someone who had left behind a place where a mystery remained unsolved. The investigators wanted answers from Whitmore directly. They arranged another interview. This time, they brought the evidence. The fingerprint, the DNA match, the timeline, the witness statements. The room was quiet as detectives placed the documents on the table. For years, Whitmore had believed the past was gone, buried, untouchable, but the past had returned, and it was sitting in front of him. At first, he remained calm. He repeated the same explanation. The evidence was wrong. The DNA must have been transferred somehow. The fingerprint did not prove anything. He claimed he had no memory of the night Emily disappeared. But detectives noticed something, a reaction, a hesitation, a brief moment where his confidence disappeared. It lasted only seconds, but investigators had spent years studying human behavior. They noticed, and they recorded everything. The interview continued for hours. Detectives asked simple questions. Where were you that night? Who did you speak with? Why was your evidence found in Emily's vehicle? Each answer created more questions. The timeline became harder for Whitmore to explain. Eventually, investigators presented another discovery. A witness who remembered seeing his truck near the location where Emily's vehicle was found. A witness who had no reason to lie. A witness whose memory had been forgotten for decades. Whitmore's expression changed. For the first time, detectives saw uncertainty. The investigation was no longer based on one piece of evidence. It was a fingerprint, DNA, a timeline, a witness, a connection, and every link led back to the same person. But then, investigators uncovered something even more disturbing. Something hidden inside the old case files, a mistake. A mistake made in the first days after Emily disappeared. A mistake that may have allowed the truth to remain hidden. In 1990, detectives collected evidence from Emily's vehicle, but the technology of the time forced them to prioritize certain items. Some evidence was tested. Other evidence was stored. One specific sample was considered too small to analyze. It was placed aside, forgotten, for 30 years. That sample would later become the key to solving the case. The evidence that nobody thought mattered. The evidence that survived when everything else disappeared. And that discovery raised a painful question. How close had investigators been in 1990? Was the answer always there? Had Emily's family spent 30 years waiting because science simply had not caught up yet? Those questions haunted everyone involved, because solving a cold case often brings two emotions at the same time, relief and regret. Relief because the truth is finally coming, regret because so much time has already been lost. For Emily's family, the announcement was overwhelming. They had spent decades imagining countless possibilities. Some believed she might still be alive, some held on to hope until the very end. But now investigators were preparing to reveal a different reality. A reality filled with pain. A reality that would finally explain the mystery. But before the case could go to trial, detectives needed one final confirmation. They needed to know exactly what happened after Emily left work that night. They needed to understand the sequence of events, because the evidence could identify a person. But the story of that night was still incomplete. And somewhere inside the remaining files was one final clue. A clue that would reveal the hidden connection between Emily Carter and Daniel Whitmore. A clue that had been overlooked for decades. A clue that would transform a missing person case into one of Arizona's most shocking cold case discoveries. The desert had kept its secret for 30 years, but now the secret was beginning to surface, and the truth waiting beneath it was more disturbing than anyone expected. The desert had a way of hiding things. For decades, the Arizona landscape had held onto a secret that nobody could uncover. The heat, the endless roads, the empty stretches of land where the sun and sky seemed permanent. It had witnessed the final moments of Emily Carter's life, but it had never revealed what happened. Until now, after 30 years, investigators were no longer searching for a missing woman. They were reconstructing a crime. Every piece of evidence pointed toward the same terrifying conclusion. Emily had not vanished by accident. Someone had been there. Someone had left behind traces, and someone had spent decades believing those traces would never be found. Daniel Whitmore, the name that had changed everything. The man whose life had remained untouched while Emily's family lived with uncertainty. But as detectives continued digging, they discovered that the story was far more complicated than a single DNA match. Because cold cases are not solved by one miracle, they are solved by hundreds of forgotten details finally coming together. And in Emily Carter's case, those details were beginning to form a disturbing picture. Investigators returned to the scene, returned to the night of the 14th of September, 1990, the final night Emily was seen alive. They rebuilt every movement, every phone call, every location, every minute. Emily had left work shortly after 7 p.m. Her coworkers remembered her walking toward her vehicle. Nothing appeared unusual. She was not running. She was not afraid. She did not appear to believe she was in danger. But somewhere between that parking lot and the abandoned desert road, everything changed. The question that haunted detectives was simple. Who did Emily expect to meet that night? Because the evidence suggested she was not randomly chosen. The person responsible knew something. They knew where she would be. They knew when she would leave. They knew enough to approach her without immediately causing alarm. That realization changed the entire investigation. This was not just a crime of opportunity. It appeared calculated. And that made Daniel Whitmore's connection even more important. Detectives examined his relationship with Emily again. They discovered that months before her disappearance, Whitmore had serviced Emily's vehicle at the repair shop where he worked. The interaction had been brief, a simple repair, a routine appointment, but investigators discovered something unsettling. Emily had returned to the shop more than once. Each time, Whitmore had been involved. An interesting part of the investigation: had Emily gotten into a vehicle because she recognized the person behind the wheel? Had she believed she was safe? The thought was impossible for investigators to ignore. Meanwhile, detectives continued examining Whitmore's life after 1990. They expected to find something obvious, a criminal record, a confession, a major mistake. But instead, they found something more complicated, a man who had carefully maintained an ordinary appearance. He paid bills, worked jobs, built relationships, lived quietly, the kind of life that makes people believe someone is incapable of terrible actions. But investigators discovered that Whitmore had another side, a side known only to a few people. Former partners described controlling behavior. Former co-workers described unpredictable anger. People who knew him remembered how quickly his mood could change, calm one moment, aggressive the next. These statements did not prove a crime, but they gave detectives a possible explanation, a possible motive, a possible window into what happened. The investigation continued expanding. Detectives located additional witnesses who had never been interviewed in 1990, people who were not considered relevant at the time, people who had moved away and forgotten about the case. One of those witnesses was a former gas station employee. In 1990, he worked near the highway leading toward the desert area where Emily's vehicle was discovered. He remembered a man stopping late that evening, a man who appeared nervous, a man who seemed to be looking out toward the desert. At the time, it was just another customer, another ordinary night. But when investigators showed him Daniel Whitmore's photograph decades later, his memory returned. The face looked familiar. The truck looked familiar. The timing looked familiar. And suddenly, a forgotten moment from 30 years ago became another piece of the puzzle. The investigation was becoming impossible to ignore, but detectives still faced a major challenge. They needed to prove that Whitmore's actions were connected directly to Emily's disappearance. A connection was not enough. Suspicion was not enough. They needed the truth, and the truth was buried inside evidence that had survived longer than anyone expected. The forensic team returned to the original materials. They examined clothing, the vehicle, archived samples, everything that remained. Modern technology allowed them to see what investigators in 1990 could not: tiny traces, invisible details, pieces of information hidden at a microscopic level. And then another discovery emerged. A second DNA profile, a profile connected to Whitmore. The evidence was stronger than before. The fingerprint was no longer standing alone. The DNA was no longer a single result. Together, they created a timeline that became increasingly difficult to deny. For the first time in 30 years, investigators believed they knew who had been inside Emily's vehicle, who had left evidence behind, who had walked away believing nobody would ever know. The county reacted with shock. People who had lived through Emily's disappearance remembered the fear all over again. The case had never truly left them. It had simply gone quiet. News reports spread quickly. Residents gathered around televisions and phones. The headline was everywhere: Arizona cold case solved. Decades old evidence identified the DNA. But behind the headline was a family experiencing emotions impossible to describe. Because an arrest does not bring back the years lost. It does not erase the empty chairs at family gatherings. It does not undo decades of wondering. For Emily's loved ones, the discovery brought answers, but it also brought pain. The truth they had waited for had finally arrived, and it was heartbreaking. As prosecutors prepared the case, investigators continued looking into one final question: did Daniel Whitmore act alone, or had someone else known the truth all along? Because detectives discovered something strange inside the original case files: a missing page, a forgotten interview, a conversation recorded 30 years earlier that had never been fully investigated. And that discovery opened an entirely new possibility. The mystery was not only about who committed the crime, it was about who knew, who stayed silent, and why. The cold case that shocked Arizona was getting closer to the truth, but the final answers were still hidden. And the deeper investigators went, the more they realized Emily Carter's story was not just about a crime. It was about time, about secrets, about the devastating cost of unanswered questions, and about a single piece of evidence that waited 30 years to finally speak. The evidence had finally begun to tell its story. After 30 years of silence, the pieces that once seemed meaningless were becoming impossible to ignore. The fingerprint, the DNA match, the forgotten witnesses, the hidden timeline. All of it was pointing toward the same conclusion. Daniel Whitmore was no longer just a name in an investigation. He was the center of one of Arizona's most shocking cold cases. But for detectives, solving the mystery was not only about identifying a suspect, it was about understanding what happened. Because Emily Carter was not just a file number, she was a daughter, a friend, a person whose life ended on a night that should have been ordinary. And every unanswered question represented another piece of her story that had been stolen. As investigators prepared the case for prosecution, they returned once again to the beginning. The 14th of September, 1990. The night everything changed. They studied Emily's final movements. They examined old photographs. They reviewed witness statements, and they discovered something that had been overlooked for decades. Emily's final route home was not random. It passed through an area where Daniel Whitmore had a reason to be, a location he knew well, a road he had traveled many times. At first, investigators in 1990 believed the desert location was chosen because it was isolated, a place where someone could disappear without being noticed. But 30 years later, detectives saw another possibility. The location was familiar, it was convenient, it was connected to someone who understood the area, someone who knew exactly where to go. That realization changed the way investigators viewed the entire case. The desert was not chosen because it was empty, it was chosen because someone knew where to go, someone knew it, someone felt comfortable there, and that someone may have been Daniel Whitmore. Investigators began examining Whitmore's movements after Emily disappeared. They found an unusual detail. The morning after Emily went missing, Whitmore did not report to work. At the time, nobody questioned it. People call in sick. People miss work. Life happens, but now detectives wondered why. They searched employment records, they contacted former supervisors. They looked for anyone who remembered his behavior during those days. One former coworker provided a disturbing detail. Whitmore arrived back at work several days later, acting differently, quiet, withdrawn, almost as if he was carrying a burden. The coworker remembered asking if something was wrong. Whitmore reportedly responded that he was tired. Nothing more, a simple explanation. But decades later, that moment became another unanswered question. What was he really carrying? Fear, guilt, or something else? Detectives knew they had to be careful. Human memories can change. People remember events differently over time. But when multiple details begin pointing in the same direction, investigators pay attention, and more details were appearing. During the renewed investigation, detectives located an old acquaintance of Whitmore's, a man who had worked with him shortly after Emily disappeared. He remembered a conversation that had stayed in his mind for years, a story, a strange comment, a moment that seemed confusing at the time. According to the witness, Whitmore had mentioned that people should be careful about trusting everyone. A strange statement, one that seemed out of place, but in 1990, nobody connected it to Emily. Nobody knew there was anything to connect. Now investigators looked at that memory differently. The investigation became a battle between the past and the present. The past had limited technology, limited resources, limited information. The present had advanced science, better databases, and a determination to finish what had been started. But there was another challenge. The public, after 3 decades, everyone had their own theories. Some believed Emily had disappeared voluntarily. Some believed she had left the state. Some believed a stranger was responsible. Others believed the answer had always been close. The announcement of Whitmore's identification destroyed those old theories instantly. The community was forced to confront a frightening possibility. The person they feared was not a mystery. He was real. He had a name. He had a history. And he had lived a normal life while Emily's family waited for answers. The emotional impact spread throughout the county. Older residents remembered the fear from 1990. Younger residents learned about the case for the first time. The story appeared everywhere. A cold case solved after decades. A hidden DNA match, a fingerprint that refused to disappear. But behind the headlines was a complicated legal battle, because prosecutors knew that a 30-year-old case required more than emotion. They needed evidence that could withstand every challenge. Defense attorneys questioned everything: the age of the evidence, the reliability of memories, the possibility of contamination, the time that had passed. Every weakness had to be examined. Every detail had to be defended. Investigators expected that. They had spent years preparing. They knew the case would not be decided by public opinion. It would be decided by facts. And the facts were growing stronger. Forensic experts explained how the DNA evidence connected Whitmore to the original crime scene. They described how advanced testing was needed. They explained how the fingerprint analysis had revealed information hidden for decades. They explained how the fingerprint analysis confirmed the connection. A piece of evidence collected when technology was still young had finally reached its full potential. The breakthrough that investigators in 1990 could only dream about had finally arrived. But then, just as the case appeared to be complete, investigators uncovered one more disturbing detail. A detail involving another person. Someone who had been interviewed during the original investigation. Someone whose name appeared in the old reports. Someone who had never been considered important. Until now. The discovery raised a terrifying question. Had Daniel Whitmore been hiding the truth alone? Or had someone else known what happened to Emily Carter? Because inside the old case file was a statement that did not match the evidence. A statement that had been accepted for 30 years. A statement that investigators now believe may have changed the entire direction of the original investigation. The cold case was solved, but the mystery was not finished, not yet, because the final chapter of Emily Carter's story would reveal not only how the crime happened, but how the truth remained hidden for so long. The truth had finally begun to emerge in the shadows. It was about uncovering every hidden decision, every forgotten clue, every moment when the truth came close and then disappeared again. The investigation into Emily Carter's disappearance had reached a new stage. Daniel Whitmore was identified. The evidence was overwhelming. The DNA matched, the fingerprint, the witness accounts, the timeline. But detectives knew something was still missing. The final explanation. The complete story of what happened on that September night in 1990. Because after 3 decades, the question remained: how did Emily Carter go from a normal evening at work to becoming the center of Arizona's most haunting mystery? And why did the person responsible believe they would never be caught? Investigators returned to the original crime scene one more time. The desert road looked different now. New signs stood where empty land once stretched for miles. New buildings had appeared in places that had once been untouched. But beneath all those changes, one thing remained: the isolation, the same silence that surrounded Emily's vehicle decades earlier. Detectives stood there imagining the scene. A young woman driving home, a familiar road, a moment where something went terribly wrong. They studied the location using modern mapping technology. They analyzed distances, travel times, possible routes, and they discovered something that changed the investigation. The place where Emily's vehicle was found was not simply a random dumping location. It was connected to Daniel Whitmore's daily routine. He knew the roads. He knew the area. He knew the places where someone could disappear without immediate discovery. The discovery sent another shock through investigators, because it suggested planning, not panic, not a sudden decision. Planning: a person who had thought about what they were doing. A person who believed they understood the environment well enough to escape consequences. But one thing Daniel Whitmore did not understand was time. Time changes everything. Technology changes. People change, but evidence can survive. And that was a mistake that would eventually expose him. The evidence he left behind had waited longer than he ever expected. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining the people connected to Whitmore in 1990. They wanted to know if anyone else had noticed something unusual. They found former neighbors, former co-workers, former acquaintances, people who lived ordinary lives without realizing they carried pieces of a decades-old puzzle. One former neighbor remembered seeing Whitmore cleaning his truck late at night shortly after Emily disappeared. At the time, it seemed normal. People clean their vehicles, people work late, people have routines. But when detectives asked about it 30 years later, the memory felt different. The timing, the behavior, the secrecy. It created another unanswered question. Why was Whitmore cleaning his vehicle at exact moment? The witness could not provide certainty, but investigators did not need certainty from every single clue. They needed consistency. They needed the pieces to fit, and slowly they did. The investigation also revealed another important detail. Whitmore had changed his appearance and lifestyle several times after leaving Arizona. Different jobs, different locations, different circles of friends. To many people, it looked like normal life. But detectives saw something else. A person constantly moving forward, always leaving the past behind, almost as if he wanted distance between himself and the place where Emily disappeared. But distance could not erase evidence. It could not erase DNA. It could not erase fingerprints. And it could not erase memories forever. The most emotional part of the investigation came when detectives met again with Emily's family. For decades, they had lived between two impossible realities. The fear that Emily was gone forever, and the hope that somehow, somewhere, she was still alive. The announcement that investigators had identified a suspect brought both relief and pain. Her family finally had an answer. But answers can hurt, because the truth they had waited for was not the truth they hoped for. The years of uncertainty had ended, but the years they lost could never return. Investigators described the moment as one of the most difficult parts of the case because every cold case has victims beyond the crime itself. The person who was taken, the family left behind, the friends who never stopped wondering, the community that never completely healed. The arrest of Daniel Whitmore reopened all those wounds, but it also brought something that had been missing for 30 years, accountability. As prosecutors prepared their case, they reviewed every piece of evidence again. They knew the defense would challenge everything. They knew the passage of time would become a major argument. 30 years creates doubt. 30 years creates questions. But investigators believed the evidence was stronger because it had survived. The DNA had not appeared recently. It had existed since 1990. The fingerprint had not been created recently. It had been collected from the original investigation. The science was new. The evidence was not. That difference became critical. The case was built on the past, strengthened by the present, and prepared for the future. Then investigators discovered the most surprising part of the entire investigation. The original detectives had actually come close, very close inside the old files. Investigators found notes showing that Whitmore's name had appeared briefly during the early investigation, but the lead was dismissed, not because of the evidence, not because detectives ignored it, not because they failed, but because they lacked the information they needed. There was no DNA match, no database connection, no technology capable of confirming what modern science could reveal. The clue existed, but it had no voice. For 30 years, it remained silent, until science finally gave it one. The discovery changed the way everyone looked at the case. The investigation had not failed because nobody knew or nobody cared. It failed because the answer was trapped behind the limits of the time, and that realization brought a strange feeling, a mixture of frustration and gratitude. Frustration for the years lost, gratitude that the evidence survived long enough to speak. But just as the case seemed ready for closure, investigators faced one final mystery, a question that had remained unanswered since the beginning. Why did Emily stop? Why did she trust the person who approached her? And what exactly happened during those final minutes before her vehicle was abandoned? Because identifying the person responsible was only part of the truth. The final moments of Emily Carter's life were still hidden, and detectives knew they needed those answers. Not only for the investigation, not only for the courtroom, but for the family that had waited 30 years to know what happened. The desert had revealed a name. The evidence had revealed a suspect. But the full story of that night was still a mystery. It was still buried beneath decades of silence, and investigators were determined to uncover every last piece. The case that had haunted Arizona for 30 years was no longer a mystery without a face. It had a name, it had evidence, it had a suspect. But for everyone who had followed Emily Carter's disappearance since 1990, one question remained heavier than all the others. What happened during the final moments of her life? Because a cold case is not truly solved when a name is discovered. It is solved when the story is finally understood, when the unanswered questions stop echoing, when the family left behind can finally close a chapter that has remained open for decades. And for Emily Carter's family, that moment was still waiting. Investigators knew the timeline had to be reconstructed with absolute precision. 30 years had passed, memories had faded, people had moved away. Some witnesses were no longer alive, but the evidence remained. And now modern technology allowed detectives to rebuild the night piece by piece. The 14th of September, 1990, a warm Arizona evening, a quiet community, a normal day that would become one of the darkest dates in county history. Emily Carter finished work shortly after 7 p.m. Security records from nearby businesses confirmed the approximate timeline. Witnesses remembered seeing her walking toward her vehicle. She appeared calm. She appeared normal. There was no sign that she believed danger was near. That detail became one of the most important parts of the investigation, because detectives believed Emily knew something about the person who approached her. She was not running. She was not trying to escape. She was not reacting like someone facing a stranger. That meant trust may have been involved, and trust changes everything. Investigators returned to Daniel Whitmore's connection with Emily. The more they looked, the clearer the pattern became. He was not a random person who appeared out of nowhere. He had been near her life before. He had interacted with her. He knew where she went. He knew her vehicle. He knew enough about her routine to avoid creating immediate suspicion. That possibility disturbed investigators, because the most dangerous person is not always the person hiding in the darkness. Sometimes it is the person standing in plain sight, someone familiar, someone who does not immediately appear threatening. The forensic team continued examining the evidence recovered from Emily's vehicle. The vehicle had become the center of the investigation, a silent witness that had waited 3 decades to reveal what happened inside. The fingerprint, the DNA, the traces left behind. Every piece told the same story. Someone else had been there. Someone else had touched the vehicle. Someone else had left behind evidence that would eventually destroy the perfect illusion of a forgotten crime. Investigators also uncovered another important detail. Daniel Whitmore had changed his story several times over the years. At first, he claimed he barely remembered Emily. Later, he admitted they had spoken occasionally. Then he suggested their interactions were more frequent, but still insignificant. The changes were small, but detectives noticed them, because innocent people usually remember important events consistently, especially when those events involve a person who disappeared. Whitmore's explanations became harder to accept, and as pressure increased, investigators began looking at his behavior after Emily vanished. They found that Whitmore had not reacted like someone surprised by a disappearance. He had not joined searches. He had not asked questions. He had not expressed concern. Instead, he continued his life while an entire community searched for answers. That contrast became one of the most painful parts of the investigation. For Emily's family, every day after the 14th of September was filled with uncertainty. Every phone call created hope. Every unknown vehicle created fear. Every passing year brought another painful anniversary. But somewhere nearby, someone knew more. Someone carried information that could have changed everything. The investigation eventually led detectives to another forgotten witness, a woman who had worked at a roadside business near the area where Emily's vehicle was found. Her memory had never been included in the original reports, not because she refused to cooperate, but because nobody knew she had seen anything important. She remembered a vehicle parked near the desert road, a dark pickup truck, a man standing outside, looking toward the highway. At the time, she assumed it was someone having car trouble. She continued with her day. She forgot about it until detectives arrived decades later. When she saw Daniel Whitmore's photograph, her reaction was immediate. She recognized him, not with complete certainty, not as someone she knew personally, but as a face connected to a memory she had buried. That moment became another important piece of the investigation, not a final answer, but another thread connecting the past and present. The prosecution began preparing the case. They knew the defense would argue that memories were unreliable. They knew 30 years created opportunities for doubt. But they also knew something else. The strongest evidence was not memory, it was science. The DNA, the fingerprint, the physical evidence, the things that did not change with time, the things that could not be forgotten. As the case moved closer to trial, the public attention grew. News organizations across Arizona revisited the story. The disappearance that had once dominated local headlines returned. The name Emily Carter appeared again, but this time it was different. This time there was a suspect, there was movement, there was the possibility of justice. Yet behind the headlines, investigators discovered something even more disturbing, a detail hidden in Daniel Whitmore's past, a detail that suggested Emily may not have been the first person to experience his troubling behavior. Detectives found old reports, minor incidents, situations that had never been connected, events that appeared unrelated, but when viewed together, they created a troubling pattern, a pattern of secrecy, a pattern of control, a pattern that investigators believed helped explain how someone could hide for so long. Because Daniel Whitmore's greatest advantage had not been luck, it had been time. Time allowed people to forget, time allowed memories to disappear, time allowed a crime to become a story from the past. But time also allowed science to advance, and eventually the very years that protected the secret became the years that exposed it. The investigation was approaching its final stage. The evidence was ready. The timeline was almost complete. The community was waiting. But one last piece remained, a confession, an explanation, something that would reveal what happened in those final minutes. Because even with all the evidence, one question still haunted detectives. Would Daniel Whitmore finally tell the truth, or would he take the secret with him? The answer would come in a moment. Nobody expected a moment inside an interrogation room. A moment when 30 years of silence finally began to break, and when it did, the entire county would learn the truth behind Arizona's most haunting cold case. The interrogation room was quiet. No cameras, no crowds, no headlines, just a table, 2 chairs, and 30 years of unanswered questions sitting between investigators and Daniel Whitmore. For decades, Emily Carter's disappearance had existed as a mystery, a case without a conclusion, a story that families whispered about, a name that appeared every year in old newspaper archives. But now, the man connected to the evidence was finally sitting across from detectives, and for the first time in 30 years, investigators had the opportunity to ask him directly, what happened to Emily Carter? Daniel Whitmore entered the room, looking different from the man described in old reports, older, slower, aged by time. But investigators knew something important. Time changes appearances. It does not erase evidence. The detectives placed the documents on the table. The fingerprint analysis, the DNA results, the witness statements, the timeline reconstruction. They did not begin with accusations. They began with the facts, because after 3 decades, facts were stronger than emotion. Whitmore looked at the evidence. He remained silent. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The silence itself became part of the investigation. Detectives had interviewed hundreds of people throughout their careers. They knew silence could mean many things: fear, anger, confusion, or someone searching for a way out. The first questions were simple. Did he know Emily Carter? Whitmore said yes, but only slightly. Had he ever been inside her vehicle? He said no. Had he ever met her outside the repair shop? He hesitated, then denied it. But the evidence was already telling a different story. The fingerprint, the DNA, the physical connection that had survived 3 decades. Investigators watched his reactions carefully, because sometimes the smallest moments reveal the biggest truths. A pause, a change in breathing, a shift in posture, a person realizing the past they buried had finally returned. Detectives continued. They asked about the night Emily disappeared. Whitmore repeated the same statement. He claimed he had no memory of the evening. He said he was home. He said he had nothing to do with her disappearance. But investigators presented another detail, a detail discovered during the renewed investigation. Phone records. Old records recovered through modern analysis. The records showed communication connected to Whitmore shortly after Emily vanished, a conversation that had never received proper attention in 1990. Whitmore looked surprised for the first time. Detectives saw uncertainty, because the past was no longer just memory, it was documented. The conversation lasted only minutes, but those minutes were the most important. Who was he calling? Why did he make that call, and why had he never mentioned it? Whitmore attempted to explain. He said he did not remember. He said the records could be wrong. He said 30 years was too long to expect anyone to remember every detail. But detectives knew something. People forget ordinary days. They forget normal conversations. But when a person disappears, certain events become impossible to ignore. The interview continued. Hours passed. The room remained tense. Then detectives asked a question they had been waiting to ask. Why was this evidence inside Emily's vehicle? Whitmore looked down. For a moment, the confident answers stopped. The explanations became shorter. The certainty disappeared. But still, he did not confess. He continued denying involvement. He claimed he had been framed by bad science. He claimed the investigation had been biased. He claimed the case had become bigger than the truth. But detectives knew the difference between suspicion and evidence, and they had both. Outside the interrogation room, the county waited. Families followed every update. Residents who had grown up hearing Emily's name watched the story unfold again. The cold case had become a symbol, a reminder that forgotten victims are not always forgotten forever, because even after decades, someone was still searching. Someone was still asking questions. Someone was still fighting for answers. The legal process moved forward. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence. Defense attorneys challenged the investigation. The arguments began. Could DNA alone prove what happened? Could a fingerprint from 30 years earlier be trusted? Could witnesses remember accurately after such a long time? Every question mattered. Every detail was examined. But investigators remained confident, because this case was not built on one piece of evidence. It was built on a chain that stretched from 1990 to the present. A chain that began with a missing woman and ended with a hidden truth finally being exposed. As preparation for trial continued, detectives discovered another piece of information, a final connection that made the timeline even clearer. They found evidence showing Whitmore had followed a pattern after Emily's disappearance, a pattern of avoiding attention, a pattern of distancing himself from Arizona, a pattern that investigators believed explained why the case remained unsolved for so long. He had not escaped because he was invisible. He had escaped because nobody had the technology to see him. The evidence was always there, waiting. The fingerprint was there. The DNA was there. The memories were there. But the tools to connect them had not been there. And that realization became one of the most emotional parts of the case, because Emily's family did not just have to wait for justice. They had to wait for science. They had to wait for a future where old evidence could finally speak. As the trial approached, the courtroom became the new center of attention. The county wanted answers, the family wanted closure, and investigators wanted the truth preserved. But before the first testimony began, prosecutors received one final report, a forensic discovery that could change everything, a discovery involving the original evidence collected from Emily's vehicle, a discovery that would explain exactly how Daniel Whitmore was connected to the crime scene and why the evidence had remained hidden for so long. The cold case that shocked Arizona was entering its final chapter. The truth was no longer buried. But the final details were about to reveal something even more disturbing, because the biggest question was no longer who was responsible. The biggest question was how someone had managed to keep a secret for 30 years. The courtroom was silent when the doors opened. After 30 years of unanswered questions, 30 years of rumors, theories, and painful uncertainty, the story of Emily Carter was finally being told in front of a judge and a jury. But this was not just a trial. It was the final battle between memory and evidence, between what people believed happened and what science could finally prove. For decades, Daniel Whitmore had carried the appearance of an ordinary man, a man who lived quietly, a man who avoided attention, a man who seemed to have escaped the shadow of a crime that haunted an entire county. But inside that courtroom, the past was waiting for him. Every decision, every lie, every piece of evidence left behind, everything was returning. The prosecution began with a single image, a photograph of Emily Carter, a young woman whose life ended on a night when she was simply trying to go home. The prosecutor did not begin with the suspect. He began with the victim, because behind every cold case headline, behind every shocking discovery, there is a person whose story deserves to be remembered. Emily was not just a name in a file. She was someone who had dreams, someone who had friends, someone who had a family waiting for her return. The courtroom listened as prosecutors described that night. She disappeared. The final hours, the abandoned vehicle, the evidence collected decades earlier, and the one question that remained unanswered for 30 years. Who was inside that vehicle with Emily? The answer, prosecutors argued, was sitting only a few feet away. Daniel Whitmore. The defense immediately challenged the case. They argued that the investigation was built on old evidence, evidence collected decades ago, evidence that had been stored, moved, and examined by different people over many years. They questioned the reliability of memories. They questioned the timeline. They questioned whether science alone could reveal what happened on a night nobody could fully reconstruct. But prosecutors were prepared, because they knew the strength of the case was not one discovery. It was the connection between all of them. The fingerprint, the DNA, the witnesses, the timeline, the pattern. Each piece standing alone was important. Together, they created a story that investigators believed could not be ignored. The first major testimony came from forensic experts. They explained the DNA analysis. They described how the evidence had been preserved, how modern testing methods allowed scientists to recover information that had been invisible in 1990. They explained that the sample was not created recently. It was not placed there during the new investigation. It had existed from the beginning. Waiting. The courtroom watched as the evidence was displayed, a microscopic connection between the past and present, a trace left behind. On the night Emily vanished, a trace that had survived 30 years of heat, time, and uncertainty. Then came the fingerprint evidence, the discovery that shocked investigators the most, because the fingerprint was not just another clue. It was a message from the past, a message that investigators in 1990 could not understand. Experts explained how the original print had been considered incomplete, how technology at the time prevented a clear identification. But modern enhancement techniques revealed details nobody could see before. The fingerprint matched Daniel Whitmore, a piece of evidence collected before anyone knew his name, before anyone suspected him, before anyone imagined the truth would lead back to him. The courtroom became silent, because everyone understood what that meant. The evidence had been there all along. The truth had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting. The prosecution then turned toward the timeline. They presented records showing Whitmore's connection to the area, his work location, his familiarity with the roads, his movements around the time Emily disappeared. They showed how small details that once seemed meaningless became important when placed together: a missed opportunity, a forgotten witness, a detail overlooked because nobody knew what it meant. Until now, then came the witnesses, people who had carried memories for decades. Some struggled to speak, some struggled to remember, but each person added another piece to the story: a truck seen near the desert road, a strange conversation, a behavior that seemed unusual, moments that passed unnoticed in 1990, moments that returned with new meaning. 30 years later, the defense attempted to weaken their testimony. They reminded the jury that memories can change, that time can alter details, that people can misremember, and they were right. Investigators knew that, but prosecutors argued something important. The case did not depend on memory alone. The physical evidence existed outside human recollection. The DNA did not forget. The fingerprint did not forget. The evidence remembered. It remained exactly where it had always been. During the trial, another emotional moment came. When Emily's family spoke, the courtroom changed. The legal arguments faded, and the human cost of the case became impossible to ignore. They described decades of waiting, decades of unanswered questions, decades of wondering whether Emily's story would ever have an ending. They described birthdays without her, holidays without her, moments when they wished they could hear her voice one more time. The courtroom listened, because behind the evidence was a family that had spent 30 years living with uncertainty. The trial was not only about proving guilt, it was about acknowledging what had been lost. As the final days of testimony approached, investigators revealed one more discovery, a piece of information hidden inside old evidence records. Something that explained why the original investigation had stalled. In 1990, detectives had collected multiple samples from Emily's vehicle, but not all evidence received equal attention. Some items were prioritized, others were stored. At the time, investigators had no reason to believe those overlooked pieces would matter. The science simply was not available, but decades later, those forgotten samples became the foundation of the entire case. The revelation shocked many people because it showed how close the truth had always been. The answer was not hidden somewhere impossible to reach. It was sitting inside an evidence room, waiting for the future. The prosecution delivered its final argument. They told the jury that this case was about time. Not the time that passed, but the time that finally revealed the truth. 30 years had passed since Emily disappeared. 30 years since a family lost someone they loved. 30 years since a community demanded answers. But time had not protected the person responsible. Time had created the opportunity to solve the case, because every year made old evidence more powerful. The defense gave its final response. They reminded the jury that every person has the right to be presumed innocent. They questioned the gaps. They questioned the uncertainty. They argued that 30 years created too many unanswered questions. The jury listened carefully because the decision before them was not about emotion. It was about evidence. After weeks of testimony, the case went to deliberation. The county waited. The family waited. Investigators, who had spent years working on the case, waited. The same question that had existed since 1990 remained. Would the truth finally be enough? Inside the jury room, 12 people reviewed the evidence: the fingerprint, the DNA, the witnesses, the timeline, the story of a woman whose disappearance had remained unsolved for 3 decades. Hours passed, then more hours. And finally, the courtroom doors opened. Everyone stood. The judge entered. The jury returned. The moment that Arizona had waited 30 years for had arrived. But before the verdict was announced, one final detail emerged. A detail that would reveal the full impact of the case. A detail that would show why Emily Carter's disappearance had remained one of the most haunting mysteries in the state. The real question was what the truth would leave behind for the family, for the community, and for everyone who believed some cold cases could never be solved. The final answer was moments away, and after 30 years of silence, Emily Carter's story was finally about to be completed. The courtroom was completely silent. For 30 years, Emily Carter's name had existed between two worlds, the world of memories and the world of unanswered questions. For 3 decades, her family had lived without certainty, without knowing what truly happened, without knowing who was responsible, without knowing that the person connected to her disappearance was still walking among them. But now everything had led to this moment. The evidence had been presented, the witnesses had spoken, the past had been reopened, and the truth that everyone had waited decades to uncover was finally standing in front of them. The jury returned to the courtroom. Every person inside knew the importance of what was about to happen. This was not just a verdict, it was the final chapter of a story that began on a quiet Arizona evening in 1990. A story that started with a missing woman, a story that became a cold case, a story that survived because someone refused to let Emily Carter be forgotten. The judge looked toward the jury. The courtroom held its breath. Then the verdict was announced. The decision sent a wave of emotion through the room. After 30 years of uncertainty, after decades of searching, after countless nights wondering if justice would ever come, the truth had finally arrived. Daniel Whitmore had been held responsible. The man who investigators believed had escaped the consequences of his actions for decades was finally facing the weight of the evidence that had waited patiently, the fingerprint that survived, the DNA that remained, the memories that returned, the pieces that finally connected. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate. News cameras surrounded the building. Residents gathered. People who had followed the case since 1990 watched as a mystery that had haunted their community finally reached the court. But the emotions were complicated because solving a cold case does not erase the pain that came before. It does not return the years lost. It does not bring back the moments that a family missed. Justice can answer questions, but it cannot reverse time. For Emily's family, the verdict brought a feeling they had waited decades to experience. Closure, not happiness, not celebration. Something deeper, a quiet, certain confirmation. No more unanswered phone calls. No more unknown people. No more imagined explanations. Now, there was only one truth, a painful truth, but a truth they could finally hold. Investigators who worked the case described the resolution as one of the most emotional moments of their careers, because this investigation was never just about evidence. It was about persistence. It was about refusing to let time erase a person's story. When Emily disappeared in 1990, many people believed the answers might never come. The technology did not exist. The information was incomplete. The trail appeared too old. The case became another file stored away among thousands of unsolved mysteries. But detectives continued believing something important. Every case leaves something behind. A trace, a memory, a piece of evidence waiting for the right moment. And Emily's case proved the belief. The fingerprint that once meant nothing became the clue that changed everything. The DNA sample that once seemed impossible to use became the connection that exposed the truth. A discovery hidden inside evidence collected decades earlier became the reason a family finally received answers. The case also changed the way many people viewed cold cases, because for years, cold cases were often considered forgotten cases with no future, cases where the passage of time seemed stronger than justice. But Emily Carter's story showed something different. Time does not. Sometimes time allows technology to catch up. Sometimes the smallest clue survives long enough to speak. Across Arizona, people who remembered Emily's disappearance reflected on what the case meant. Older residents remembered the fear that spread through the county in 1990. They remembered conversations at dinner tables, warnings between neighbors, the feeling that something terrible had happened, but nobody knew why. Younger residents, people who were children when Emily vanished, learned the story years later. For them, it was a reminder that every missing person represents a real life, a real family, a real story. Not just a headline, not just a file number. The investigation also left behind difficult questions. Questions about how many other cold cases might still contain hidden answers. How many forgotten pieces of evidence remain untouched. How many families are still waiting. How many truths are trapped inside old records, waiting for technology to reveal them? Because the discovery in Emily's case was not just about one investigation. It was proof that the past is never completely silent. It speaks through evidence, through memories, through the people who refuse to stop searching. Years after the verdict, the desert roads of Arizona remain the same endless horizon, the same quiet landscape, the same places where Emily's story began, but the meaning had changed. The road that once represented mystery now represented answers. The place where a family once felt only lost now carried the memory of justice. Emily Carter's name was no longer connected only to disappearance. It was connected to perseverance, to determination, to the belief that even the oldest mysteries can still be solved. The case that shocked an entire county had finally reached its ending. But the impact remained, because every cold case solved creates a reminder. Behind every investigation is someone who mattered, someone who is loved, someone whose story deserves to be completed. And for 30 years, Emily Carter's story waited. It waited inside evidence boxes. It waited inside forgotten reports. It waited inside the memories of people who refused to move on, until one day, a single hidden DNA match changed everything. A single fingerprint revealed what decades of searching could not. A single discovery reopened a door that everyone thought had been permanently closed. When that door opened, the truth came out, not quickly, not easily, but finally. The desert kept its secret for 30 years. The evidence kept its message for 30 years, and Emily Carter's story remained unfinished for 30 years, until science caught up, until investigators looked again, until the past finally answered, because some mysteries disappear with time. But some wait, some survive. Some remain buried until the world is ready to hear the truth. And in Arizona, after 3 decades of silence, one cold case finally spoke. The final chapter of Emily Carter's story did not end when the courtroom emptied. It did not end when the cameras disappeared. It did not end when the headlines moved on to another story. Because for the people who lived through those 30 years, the case was never just about an arrest. It was about a question that followed them every single day. What happens when someone disappears and the world keeps moving? For Emily's family, time was something they could measure in painful moments. Another birthday, another holiday, another year without answers. Every calendar page carried the same reminder. Emily was gone, but the mystery remained. Until it didn't. The discovery that solved the case became more than a forensic breakthrough. It became proof that forgotten victims are not truly forgotten. Their stories remain. Their evidence remains. Their names remain. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the smallest detail can bring everything back. Investigators later reflected on the case and the lesson it left behind. They remembered the early days of the investigation, the searches through the desert, the interviews, the endless hours spent following leads that went nowhere. They remembered the frustration, the moments when they believed the answer might never come, but they also remembered something else. Hope, because even when a case becomes cold, it is never truly dead. A cold case is simply a story waiting for another chapter. Technology provided that chapter. Modern forensic science transformed the impossible into reality. The evidence that once sat quietly inside an archive became the center of the investigation. A fingerprint collected in a different era. A DNA sample preserved through time. Pieces of information that seemed powerless until they were combined. And when they were combined, they revealed something that changed everything. The person responsible had never been invisible. He had simply been hidden behind the limitations of the past. The world around him changed. Technology changed. Investigators changed. But the evidence stayed exactly where it had always been. Waiting. That was the most haunting part of Emily Carter's case. The answer had existed all along, buried inside the same evidence that investigators had collected in 1990. The difference was not the evidence. The difference was the ability to understand it. The case became a reminder to investigators everywhere. Never assume a case is finished forever. Never assume a clue has no value. Never assume time has erased the truth. Because every piece of evidence carries a story. Every fingerprint, every trace, every forgotten photograph, every handwritten note inside an old case file. They are pieces of history waiting for someone to listen. Years after Emily's disappearance, people in the county continued remembering her. Not because of the tragedy alone, but because of the person she was. Friends remembered her laughter, her kindness, the way she helped people, the way she made ordinary moments feel important. The investigation had always focused on finding answers. But after the case was solved, the community focused on something else, remembering Emily. Because a person's life should never become only a story of how it ended, Emily Carter was more than a cold case, more than a headline, more than an investigation. She was a person whose story mattered, and after 30 years, her story finally had an ending. But the echoes of the case continued across the country. Families of missing people followed the investigation closely. For some, it brought hope. For others, it brought painful reminders. The reality that many questions remain unanswered. Many families still wait. Many names still appear on missing person lists. Many evidence boxes remain unopened. But Emily's case proved one important thing. The passage of time does not always mean the loss of justice. Sometimes it means waiting for the right moment, the right technology, the right person willing to look again. The final images of Emily Carter's story were not of a courtroom, not of an arrest, not of a suspect. They were of a family finally able to speak her name without only feeling unsafe. They were of investigators closing a file that had remained open for decades. They were of a community that finally understood what happened. The desert remained quiet. The roads remained long. The Arizona sky remained endless. But the mystery was gone. The silence was broken. The truth had arrived. 30 years after Emily Carter disappeared, a hidden DNA match changed everything. A decades-old fingerprint shocked detectives. A forgotten piece of evidence transformed an impossible investigation. And one cold case that many believed would never be solved finally revealed its secret. Because some truths may hide, some truths may wait, some truths may disappear beneath years of silence. But eventually, the past finds a way back. And when it does, it tells the story that was always waiting to be heard. Years after the investigation officially ended, the name Emily Carter continued to appear whenever investigators discussed the power of modern forensic science. Not because the case was remembered only for the crime, but because it represented something much bigger. A warning. A reminder. A promise. That time does not always protect those who hide the truth. For decades, Daniel Whitmore believed the distance between 1990 and the future would be enough. He believed memories would disappear. He believed evidence would become meaningless. He believed the desert would keep what happened hidden forever, but he misunderstood one thing. The desert remembers. The evidence remembers. And eventually, someone always comes looking again. The investigators who reopened Emily's case often described the moment they saw the DNA match as unforgettable. They had seen thousands of reports, thousands of pieces of evidence, thousands of names connected to investigations. But this was different, because this was a name connected to a woman who had been waiting 30 years for answers, a name that transformed a forgotten file into a living investigation again. The moment was not just scientific, it was emotional. Behind the technology was a family. Behind the database match was a person. Behind the fingerprint was a story. That was something detectives never forgot. The investigation was not about solving a puzzle. It was about giving a voice back to someone who could no longer speak. Emily's disappearance had changed an entire community. In 1990, fear spread quickly. People looked at unfamiliar faces differently. Parents worried about their children. Neighbors checked on each other more often. The disappearance became part of the county's history, a story passed from one generation to another. People who were children when Emily vanished grew up hearing her name. They heard about the woman who left work one evening and never came home. They heard about the search, the unanswered questions, the years of waiting. And then, decades later, they heard something they never expected. The case was solved. The impossible had happened. The mystery had an answer. But the resolution also revealed something painful. There were no perfect endings. There were only truths. And sometimes the truth arrives carrying both relief and heartbreak. For Emily's family, closure came with complicated emotions. They finally knew. But knowing does not erase memories. It does not erase empty spaces at family gatherings. It does not erase the years stolen by uncertainty. But it does something important. It replaces endless questions with reality. And sometimes, reality is the first step toward healing. Investigators also revisited the lessons from the original investigation. They acknowledged the limitations of the time. In 1990, detectives worked with the tools available to them. They followed leads. They collected evidence. They searched. They did everything they could with what they knew. But science has a way of changing the future. The evidence that could not speak in 1990 became the evidence that solved the case decades later. That is why investigators continue preserving old evidence. Because they understand something now that previous generations could only hope for. The future may have the answers the present does not. A fingerprint is not just a fingerprint. A sample is not just a sample. A forgotten item inside an evidence box is not just an object. It may be the final sentence of a story that has not been finished yet. Emily Carter's case became one of those stories. A story that survived. A story that refused to disappear. Perhaps the most powerful part of the entire investigation was not the arrest, not the courtroom, not the headlines. It was the moment when everyone realized something simple. Emily had never truly been forgotten, not by her family, not by investigators, not by the community. The years passed. The world changed, but the search continued. That determination became the reason the truth was eventually found. The final chapter of the Arizona cold case was written decades after the first page. A story that began with confusion ended with answers. A story that began with silence ended with a voice. A story that began with loss ended with justice. The desert night where Emily disappeared remained part of Arizona's history, but it was no longer only a place of fear. It became a symbol of something else: persistence. Because even in the darkest cases, even after the longest wait, even when hope seems impossible, answers can still come. A single fingerprint, a hidden DNA match, a forgotten memory, a detective willing to look again. Sometimes that is all it takes to reopen a door that has been closed for decades, and behind that door, the truth has been waiting the entire time. The story of Emily Carter is now remembered not only as one of Arizona's most haunting cold cases, but as a reminder that every missing person has a story, every family deserves answers, every piece of evidence matters, and every mystery, no matter how old, still has the possibility of being solved. Because time can bury secrets, but it cannot erase the truth. And after 30 years beneath the Arizona sun, the truth finally came home. But even after justice was delivered, one question remained in the minds of everyone who followed the case. How many other stories were still waiting? How many families were still staring at old photographs, hoping for answers? How many forgotten evidence boxes were still sitting in silent rooms, holding pieces of someone's final moments? The investigation into Emily Carter's disappearance became more than a solved case. It became a symbol that no file is ever truly closed. Not when a family is still searching, not when a victim's name is still being spoken, not when unanswered questions remain. For the detectives who reopened the investigation, the case represented everything that makes cold cases different from ordinary investigations. The passage of time creates obstacles, but it also creates opportunities. Every year brings new technology. Every decade brings new methods. Every generation of investigators has the chance to discover what the previous one could not. And sometimes the difference between an unsolved mystery and a solved crime is not a new witness, not a confession, not a dramatic discovery. Sometimes it is one tiny detail that was there from the beginning, one detail that everyone overlooked, one detail that waited decades for someone to understand. That was the legacy of Emily Carter's case. The evidence had been collected. The questions had been asked. The investigation had begun, but the answer was trapped behind time, until time finally became the thing that revealed it. It also changed the way many residents viewed their own community. For years, people had wondered if the person responsible was still nearby, if they had walked past them in a store, past them on the street, shared a conversation without knowing the truth. That realization was difficult, because the most frightening mysteries are not always about unknown places or unknown people. Sometimes they are about ordinary moments, a familiar face, a normal conversation, a person who appears harmless. That was what made Emily's disappearance so haunting. Its fear did not come only from what happened. It came from the possibility that the truth had been close all along. But the final years of the investigation changed the way people remembered the case. The story was no longer only about fear. It became about determination, about investigators who refused to abandon an unanswered question, about technology that transformed the impossible into reality, about a family that continued searching even when the world told them the answer might never come. Because that is what happens with the strongest cold cases. They survive because someone refuses to let them disappear. A photograph remains on a wall. A name remains in a report. A memory remains in someone's heart. And eventually, those pieces come together. The final evidence review of Emily's case revealed something new. The solution was not found because one person suddenly remembered everything. It was not found because one clue magically appeared. It was found because decades of information finally connected. The original investigation, the preserved evidence, the new technology, the renewed determination. Everything became part of the same story. And that is why the case became unforgettable. Not because it lasted 30 years, but because after 30 years, it still had an answer. The final images of the investigation were not dramatic. There were no flashing lights, no chase, no sudden discovery in the middle of the night. Instead, there was something quieter. A family receiving confirmation, a detective closing an old file, a community finally understanding what happened, a name finally connected to the evidence, a story finally complete. The desert remained exactly where it had always been. The same roads, the same horizon, the same endless sky. But the meaning had changed. For decades, that landscape represented uncertainty. Now it represented the moment when the truth finally emerged. Because places remember, communities remember, families remember, and sometimes history remembers for those who cannot speak. Emily Carter's name became part of that history, a reminder that every victim deserves more than a headline. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be found. They deserve justice. And even when decades pass, even when the trail grows cold, even when the world believes the answers are gone, there is always a possibility that somewhere, hidden beneath the silence, the truth is still waiting. Waiting for the right person, waiting for the right technology, waiting for the right moment. The Arizona cold case that shocked an entire county began with a disappearance. It ended with a discovery hidden inside a fingerprint, a discovery hidden inside DNA, a discovery that proved one undeniable fact. The past never truly disappears. It leaves behind traces, and those traces can wait years, they can wait decades, they can wait until the entire world changes. But eventually, they speak. And when they speak, they tell the truth.